Something happens that nobody talks about. Not the pushing. That part gets discussed. The withdrawal, the distance, the slow and sometimes sudden way the avoidant creates space, until the empath, exhausted and depleted and finally out of the reaching that had been sustaining the dynamic, goes quiet. That part is documented, understood. The push and the eventual silence of the pushed. That arc is familiar to anyone who has spent time inside this dynamic. What doesn't get discussed is what happens next. Inside the avoidant, in the days and weeks after the empath's silence arrives, in the specific, interior, not visible from outside experience of someone whose system got exactly what it was asking for, space, distance, the relief of no longer being reached toward, and discovered that getting what it was asking for was not the same as getting what it actually needed. The collapse. Not a dramatic collapse, not a breakdown visible from the outside, the internal kind, the specific quiet foundational destabilization of someone whose entire architecture was built around a belief that turns out, in the silence of the empath's absence, to be insufficient. The belief that they were better off alone. What the avoidant thought the silence would feel like, the avoidant did not engineer the empath's silence with full awareness of what they were doing. That needs to be said clearly because the narrative of deliberate manipulation, while emotionally satisfying in some ways, is not accurate and does not serve genuine understanding. The pushing was not a plan. It was a system running its programming. The distancing, the cooling, the withdrawal of presence and warmth and availability. These were the avoidance nervous system doing what it always does when intimacy deepens past a threshold that feels manageable, reducing the threat, creating the space that the alarm was demanding. And on some level, not a conscious, articulated level, but the level at which the system operates, the avoidant expected the silence to feel like what distance always feels like, relief. The specific, familiar, deeply grooved relief of pressure lifting, of the ambient demand of another person's emotional presence and need, and genuine investment reducing to something manageable, of the walls being back up and the interior being private again, and the exhausting calculation of what continued closeness would cost finally becoming unnecessary. The avoidant has felt this relief before. Every time the distance has been successfully created, every time a relationship has been managed back to something less intimate and therefore less threatening, the relief is real. It has functioned as confirmation that the distance was right, that the self-sufficiency is genuine, that they are, fundamentally, someone who is better with space. So the empath's silence was supposed to feel like that. It doesn't. Why this silence is different. The avoidant has experienced other silences, other withdrawals, other people who eventually stopped reaching and allowed the distance to become permanent. Those silences had a particular quality, the quality of something that was always somewhat available, being made unavailable, the quality of someone whose orientation toward the avoidant was still, even in the silence, fundamentally responsive to the avoidant's movements, who was quiet but watchful, withdrawn but still, at some level, waiting. The empath's genuine silence, the silence that arrives not from strategy but from the actual exhaustion produced, I have genuinely redirected my energy elsewhere place, has a different quality entirely. It does not feel like withdrawal. It feels like absence, not the absence of contact, the absence of orientation. The specific, palpable, registers in the body difference between someone who is not reaching towards you and someone who is no longer primarily pointed in your direction. The avoidance nervous system, which is calibrated with unusual sensitivity to the emotional weather of intimate connections, feels this difference before the conscious mind has processed it, registers the quality of the silence as categorically different from the silences that came before, and the registration produces something the system was not prepared for, not relief, the early edge of loss. The architecture that starts to fail. The avoidant has built their interior life around a set of beliefs that function, most of the time, as reliable load-bearing structures. The belief in self-sufficiency, The belief that closeness is more costly than distance. The belief that the best version of their life is the one most fully under their own management. These beliefs have been tested before, have held before, have been reinforced by every previous experience of creating distance and finding the relief that seemed to confirm them. But the empath's genuine silence tests them differently, because the empath, the specific kind of empath who has been described throughout this conversation, the one who feels deeply and has genuine interior substance and is not organized primarily around the avoidance response, is not a person whose absence is easily managed. Their presence, when it was present, had a quality, something the avoidance system, for all its vigilance, allowed in. Not fully. The system is never fully off, but enough. The specific warmth, the genuine seeing, the quality of being with someone who did not require constant performance or management or the careful calibration of how much of themselves to show. Something about that was allowed to become part of the avoidance daily experience, not acknowledged as such, not registered consciously as something being depended upon, but present in the background, the way things are present when they have become part of the texture of ordinary life, and now it is gone, not managed to a safer distance, actually gone, redirected toward a life that does not include the avoidant as its primary orientation, and the load-bearing beliefs begin to encounter a problem they have not previously faced. They are not adequate to the weight of this specific absence. The self-sufficiency that held before does not hold in the same way now, not because self-sufficiency was always false. It was real in its limited way, but because the empath's presence had quietly expanded what the avoidant's life was capable of feeling like, and the contraction back to the pre-empath baseline does not feel like return to normal. It feels like reduction, like loss, like the specific and irreversible understanding that what was there was not ordinary, was not replaceable by the default texture of a self-managed life, was something. The collapse itself, the collapse is not dramatic. It does not look from the outside like collapse. The avoidant continues to function, goes to work, maintains their routines, engages with the world in the ways they have always engaged with it. But something is different underneath. The flatness that arrives is different from the ordinary flatness of a life without major event. It has a specific quality, the quality of something having been subtracted. Not just the empath's presence, but what the empath's presence produced, the register of experience that was available in their company, the specific aliveness of being genuinely known by someone who did not require the knowing to be managed. The avoidant finds themselves doing what the empath did in the early days of the dynamic, thinking about them at inconvenient times, not with the clean, manageable quality of someone processing a past relationship, with the specific, intrusive, refuses to be filed quality of something unresolved. The management protocol engages the busyness, the productivity, the forward momentum of a life that looks, from every external angle, like someone who is fine. But the collapse continues underneath the management, quietly, persistently, in the specific way that things collapse when the structure holding them up was never as solid as it appeared. The structure was the belief that distance is always better, that self-sufficiency is always sufficient, that the cost of closeness always exceeds the cost of its absence. The empath's genuine silence is the evidence that dismantles the structure, because the distance is present now. The self-sufficiency is being called upon. The cost of absence is being felt directly, and it is higher than the cost of closeness ever actually was. That recognition, arriving not as a thought, but as a felt, body level can't be argued with experience, is the collapse. What the avoidant does with the collapse, here is where the story diverges, where the psychology produces two different outcomes depending on what the avoidant does, with the recognition that the silence has cost them more than they anticipated. Some reach. The collapse produces action. The management protocol fails to contain the recognition, and something, the reaching, that has been described throughout this conversation, The signal sent sideways and obliquely, and with maximum deniability, surfaces. The avoidant makes contact, however qualified, however wrapped in the language of neutrality, however carefully constructed to allow retreat if the vulnerability of reaching turns out to be too much. They reach. And the empath, whose silence was genuine rather than strategic, receives the reaching from a genuinely different place than the earlier dynamic would have produced. Not with the flood of relief, not with the immediate reorganization of attention back toward the avoidant, but with the clear-eyed, grounded, what is actually being offered assessment of someone who has done real work in the silence and is not available to simply resume the previous configuration. Other avoidants do not reach. The collapse happens, and the management protocol, however strained, reasserts itself. The reaching that was almost produced gets intercepted. The recognition that the silence cost more than anticipated gets filed under temporary adjustment period. Not enough time, needs more distance. The structure that was failing gets shored up with additional narrative rather than replaced with something truer. These avoidants carry the collapse internally, unwitnessed, converting it over time into the specific and persistent gray that has been described throughout this conversation. The ambient flatness of someone who made the choice their system recommended and is living with the result of that choice in the private, unacknowledged interior of a life that looks, from every available angle, like someone who is fine. Both outcomes are real. Both happen. Which one occurs is not within your control and cannot be predicted from the outside. What the empath needs to know about this: if you are the empath whose silence produced the collapse, or whose silence is in the process of producing it, there is something important to understand about your position in this moment. You are not waiting for the collapse to produce their reaching, or you should not be. Not because the reaching won't happen. It may, but because organizing your silence around the hope that it will produce collapse, and collapse will produce reaching, and reaching will produce the relationship you needed, that is not silence. That is strategy wearing the costume of silence. And the avoidant, whose nervous system is calibrated to distinguish between genuine absence and performed absence, will feel the difference, will recognize in the quality of the silence whether it is the real thing or the managed thing. And managed silence, however skillfully managed, does not produce the collapse that genuine silence produces. It produces the avoidance recognition of being handled, which produces not collapse, but increased distance. The silence that produces the collapse is the silence of someone who is genuinely redirected, who is actually living their own life, who is not monitoring the avoidance response to the silence because their attention is genuinely elsewhere. That silence cannot be performed. It can only be arrived at through the actual, unglamorous, non-linear process of genuinely investing in your own life until the investment is real enough that the monitoring stops not because you decided to stop, but because there is genuinely something else to attend to. If you are there, if the silence is real, then the collapse, if it happens, will find you in a genuinely different place than the dynamic left you. And that place will allow you to respond to whatever the collapse produces with the clarity and self-possession that genuine forward motion provides. If you are not there yet, if the silence is still partly monitoring, partly strategic, partly organized around what it will produce in them, then the most useful thing is not to think about their collapse. It is to keep building, keep investing, keep redirecting attention toward the life that is actually yours, until the redirection is genuine rather than performed. The collapse is theirs to experience. Your life is yours to build. Those are the only two things worth attending to right now. And of the two, only one is actually within your reach. Why avoidance collapse after pushing empaths into silence? Continued. There is something worth being straight about before continuing. This conversation has covered a lot of ground. Script after script, continuation after continuation, each one going deeper into the avoidance psychology, their interior experience, what they feel when you leave, what breaks their reality, what touches them deeper than love, why they collapse when you go silent. All of it has been genuine. The psychology is real. The patterns are real. The validation of an experience that is genuinely disorienting and genuinely painful, that has been real too. But there is a question worth sitting with honestly right now. How much of this is actually helping you move forward? Not rhetorically, genuinely. Because there is a version of deep psychological understanding that liberates, that removes self-blame, restores accuracy, allows grief to be honest and clean and forward-moving. And there is a version that does something else. That provides sophisticated company for staying oriented towards someone who is not fully available. That makes the ongoing investment of attention in someone else's interior feel like growth rather than the continuation of a pattern that has already cost enough. Only you know which version this has become for you. The collapse and what it actually changes, the avoidant collapses after pushing the empath into silence. That is real. The specific interior, foundational destabilization of someone whose belief in self-sufficiency meets the concrete evidence of its insufficiency. That happens. The gray arrives. The flatness, the persistent, unmanageable quality of an absence that the management protocol cannot file away cleanly. And here is the honest thing about what that collapse changes. By itself, without the avoidant choosing to do something with the recognition it produces, it changes nothing practical. The collapse is an interior event. It is real and significant and genuinely painful for the avoidant. But interior events, however significant, do not automatically produce exterior change. Do not automatically produce the reaching, the acknowledgement, the sustained behavioral shift that a functional relationship actually requires. The collapse is the raw material for change. It is not the change, and the distance between raw material and actual change is filled entirely by the avoidance choices, their willingness to face what the collapse is telling them, their readiness to do the work that facing it requires, their decision made not in the moment of acute loss, but in the ordinary, sustainable, daily repeated way that real decisions are made, to become someone capable of what they feel. That decision cannot be produced by your silence, cannot be accelerated by your patience, cannot be inspired into existence by the quality of what you brought to the relationship or the depth of the love that is still present in you. It belongs to them, entirely, without exception. And understanding the collapse, knowing it is happening, understanding why it happens, recognizing its significance, does not change that. What this pattern has been teaching, there is something the anxious avoidant dynamic teaches that is worth naming directly, not as consolation, as the honest extraction of what is genuinely useful from an experience that has cost real things. It teaches the difference between depth of feeling and capacity for relationship. These are not the same thing. They feel like they should be. The intuition is strong that someone who feels deeply is therefore capable of the sustained, present, consistently available love that a relationship requires. That genuine emotion translates into reliable showing up. But the avoidant is the specific and consequential counterexample to that intuition. They feel genuinely, deeply in the refusing to stop way that has been documented throughout this conversation. The collapse after the empath's silence is evidence of the depth of what they feel. The love is real. The missing is real. The specific, irreplaceable quality of what the empath brought is registered clearly and missed acutely, and they are still, in their current state, not reliably capable of the relationship. The feeling and the capacity are genuinely separate, and learning to assess both, to ask not only does this person feel something real, but are they currently capable of acting from what they feel in the sustained, imperfect, shows up on Tuesdays way that a real relationship requires, is one of the most valuable things this experience can leave you with. Not because it makes you more guarded, because it makes you more accurate, more able to see clearly what is actually being offered, rather than what the depth of feeling suggests might eventually be possible. The empath's own collapse, something that has been under-addressed throughout this entire conversation. The empath collapses too, not in the same way, not with the specific belief dismantling quality of someone whose foundational self-sufficiency narrative has met its limit, but in the quieter, more private, less theorized way of someone who gave generously and consistently and at real cost, and then had to find their way to the silence, not because they wanted distance, but because the reaching had finally completely run out. That depletion is its own collapse. The specific exhaustion of someone whose empathic capacity, genuine, substantial, not a performance, has been running primarily outward for too long. Who has been seeing and understanding and holding space and offering the specific wound-aimed care that reaches past ordinary love, and has been doing it largely without reciprocation, adequate to sustain it. The empath's silence is not a strategy. It is the honest expression of a system that has reached its limit, that cannot continue the expenditure without refilling, that has, in the most basic and human sense, run out. And that running out deserves the same compassion and the same honest attention that this conversation has been extending to the avoidance interior experience. You ran out, not because you were insufficient, because you were giving into a dynamic that was not giving back in proportion, because the empathic generosity that is one of your most significant qualities was being drawn on without adequate replenishment. That is not a character flaw. It is the natural consequence of sustained generosity meeting insufficient reciprocity. And the silence, however it arrived, through exhaustion or healing, or the gradual, non-dramatic redirection of attention toward your own life, the silence was not failure. It was the most honest thing you have done in this dynamic. What genuine recovery looks like for the empath. Recovery from this dynamic is not primarily about the avoidant. This seems obvious and yet is consistently complicated by the ongoing orientation toward their interior that the dynamic installs. Recovery is about the empath specifically, about what was depleted and what needs to be restored, about the specific qualities that this dynamic drew on most heavily and what replenishes them. The empathic capacity needs reciprocity, not in the grand sense, not a partner who matches insight for insight, and vulnerability for vulnerability, and seeing for seeing in perfect symmetry, but in the basic, sustainable sense of a relational environment where the giving and receiving are roughly proportional, where the attunement flows in both directions, often enough that the empath's capacity is being replenished rather than consistently drawn down. The self-trust needs restoration, because one of the more insidious effects of the avoidant dynamic on the empath is the gradual erosion of trust in their own perception. The empath sees the avoidant clearly, sees the wound, the love, the capacity and its limits, and is still in pain. And that continued pain, despite the clarity of their seeing, begins to register as something being wrong with their perception, as though seeing clearly should have protected them, as though the understanding should have prevented the hurt. It doesn't. Seeing clearly does not protect from the pain of loving someone who cannot fully receive the love. And the empath who has been through this needs to reclaim the trust in their own perception as separate from its ability to prevent pain. Clarity and protection are different things. The clarity was real. The pain was also real. Both were appropriate. The sense of being ordinary needs not restoring exactly, but perhaps discovering for the first time. Because the empath in this dynamic often finds their deepest qualities used as the explanation for why the dynamic was so acute. Their sensitivity, their attunement, their capacity for genuine seeing, these become the reasons the dynamic hurts so specifically and so deeply. And there is a way that being special in a wound becomes its own kind of burden. Recovery includes the ordinary, the unspecial days, the relationships that are warm without being electrically charged, the connections that sustain rather than consume. The slow discovery that a life without constant intensity is not a life without depth. It is a life with the kind of depth that is actually livable. The question that ends this, every script in this conversation has been circling a center. Different approaches, different angles, different depths of psychological portrait, all of it circling the same place. The question of what you are going to do with your life, not in the grand sense, in the immediate practical, what are you actually doing with your attention today sense. The avoidance collapse is real. Their refusing love is real. The specific, irreplaceable quality of what was between you is real. All of it is real, and none of it requires your ongoing primary attention to remain real. It will be real whether you are thinking about it or not. The love that refuses independently of your observation of it. The collapse happens in their interior without requiring your witness. The significance of the connection does not diminish because you have redirected your attention toward your own life. What requires your attention, what actually needs you in the present tense, right now, is your own life. The work that is yours, the people who are actually present and available and capable of the reciprocity that sustains rather than depletes. The daily, ordinary, unglamorous investment in the things that make your existence feel genuinely inhabited rather than suspended pending resolution. The collapse in them is theirs to experience. The life available to you is yours to live. Those two things are happening simultaneously, in parallel, independent of each other. And of the two, only one actually needs you. Your own life is waiting, not as consolation, as the real thing, the only real thing that has ever been fully, unconditionally, without exception yours. Go be in it, completely, starting now. Why avoidance collapse after pushing empaths into silence? Continued. There is something worth saying in the space of 1,000 words that all the previous thousands have been building toward, but not quite landing on directly. The avoidant collapses. That is real. The empath goes silent. The self-sufficiency belief meets its limit. The gray arrives, the management protocol strains under the weight of an absence it was not built to hold. But here is the thing about collapses. They happen to the person collapsing, not to you, not in your presence, not requiring your witness, not producing anything that lands in your daily life in the form you actually need things to land. The collapse is an interior event in someone else's interior, and you are standing outside it. The honest weight of that, you have spent real time, real attention, real emotional energy, real portions of your actual life, understanding what happens inside someone who pushed you into silence, what their nervous system does, what belief structures fail, what the gray feels like from the inside, why the management protocol cannot hold what it was built to hold. That understanding is not nothing. It is accurate and it is compassionate, and it reflects something genuinely remarkable about your capacity to see human beings clearly, even when those human beings have cost you something real. But understanding someone's collapse does not warm you, does not call you on a Wednesday, does not show up when the day's been hard, does not offer the specific ordinary, present tense accompaniment that a human life actually requires to feel genuinely inhabited rather than theoretically full. The collapse happens in them. You live in your life, and those two things are separated by a distance that understanding alone cannot close. What the silence actually gave you, the silence that pushed the avoidant toward collapse, the genuine, exhaustion-produced, finally redirected silence, gave you something too. Not as a reward for enduring the dynamic, not as the silver lining that makes the cost retrospectively worth it, but as the natural consequence of attention returning to the place it belongs. It gave you back the hours, the specific, daily, one-at-a-time hours that had been going into the reaching and the understanding and the careful, effortful navigation of someone else's capacity and what it could and could not hold. Those hours are yours now, not abstractly, concretely. Today has hours in it. Tomorrow has hours in it. The week ahead is made of hours that are not spoken for by the dynamic, not consumed by the reaching, not organized around the question of what is happening in someone else's interior. What are you doing with them? Not what should you be doing. What are you actually doing? What is filling the space that the dynamic used to fill? Whether what is filling it is genuinely yours, actually interesting to you, actually nourishing, actually moving your life in a direction that is yours rather than a direction that is simply away from the pain. That question is more important than any further understanding of the collapse. The plain version of this: you loved someone deeply, genuinely, with the specific and extraordinary quality of someone who sees past the surface into the actual person and loves what they find there. That person's system could not hold what you offered, not because what you offered was wrong, because the system had been built long before you arrived to intercept exactly that kind of offering. You reached until you couldn't anymore. The silence arrived, not as strategy, but as the honest limit of what the reaching could sustain. The avoidant, in the silence, collapsed, felt the weight of what their system had cost them, encountered the specific, irreversible understanding that the self-sufficiency they had been performing was not sufficient for the actual texture of their life without you in it. That collapse is happening, or has happened, or will happen in some form. It does not require anything from you, not your witness, not your return, not your continued orientation toward their interior, while your own life moves forward without your full presence in it. The collapse is theirs. Your life, the actual present tense, made of real hours life that is happening right now, is yours. Be in it. Not in the performing being in it way, in the actual unmonitored, genuinely occupied way that produces a life that feels like yours rather than like the waiting room of someone else's becoming. The collapse is real. Your life is also real. And of the two, the interior event in someone else's experience and the actual hours of your actual days, only one is asking for you. Only one has always been asking for you. Yours. Go. Why? Avoidants collapse after pushing empaths into silence. Continued. The collapse is theirs. That is the whole of it, said as plainly as it can be said. Not yours to witness, not yours to respond to, not yours to hold in the center of your attention, while the hours of your actual life continue moving regardless of where your attention is located. The avoidant pushed. You went silent. Something in them failed to hold what it was built to hold. That sequence is real, and it matters, and it does not require one more word of your energy to be true. What requires your energy is simpler and more immediate, and has been waiting patiently through every layer of understanding this conversation has built. Your own day, the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable hours of it, the people in it who are actually present, the work that is actually yours, the life that is not waiting to begin once this resolves. It is already happening. You are already in it. Whether or not you are fully present to it, the only question is whether you show up for it completely, not eventually. Today. That is enough.